Thunder split the sky like an angry god's whip, shaking the windows of the small house on Elm Street. Rain hammered against the cracked glass, but even the storm's fury could not compete with the shrill voice that ripped through the walls. Margaret's words were sharp and venomous, cutting through Clara's chest like blades. The ultrasound photo lay crumpled on the coffee table, damning evidence of a secret Clara had clung to for 12 desperate weeks. Margaret's manicured hand trembled with rage as she waved it in the air. "You filthy little disgrace," she spat, her face twisted in hatred. "Do you know what you've done to this family? To me? 3 months you've been hiding this, sneaking around under my roof, making us the laughingstock of the neighborhood." Clara sat frozen on the threadbare sofa, her trembling fingers pressed instinctively to the small swell of her belly. Her lips parted, but the words barely escaped. "It's not what you think. I didn't plan for this. It was one night." The crack of Margaret's palm across her cheek silenced her. Clara's head snapped sideways, her skin stinging, but she refused to let the tears fall. 10 years with Margaret had taught her that showing weakness only fed the cruelty. "One night of spreading your legs like a streetwalker, you mean?" Margaret's voice dripped with contempt. "Do you have any idea what people will say? How dare you parade your shame into this house?" Clara turned desperately toward her father, who lingered in the doorway like a shadow. His shoulders slumped, his hands twisted together, his eyes downcast. He had once promised to protect her, but years of Margaret's rule had hollowed him out. "She's still my daughter," he whispered weakly. "Maybe we can work something out." Margaret whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "Your daughter has destroyed everything I built. 10 years of respect in this community. Gone. And you want to coddle her?" "No. She leaves. Tonight." Clara's breath caught. "Please, Daddy," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. For a fleeting moment, she hoped he would lift his head, meet her eyes, and fight for her. But Robert stared at the floor, silent and broken. The truth was carved into the lines of his face. He would never choose her over Margaret. "Pack your things," Margaret snapped, yanking Clara to her feet with bruising force. "You have 10 minutes, and don't think for a second you'll ever come back." The house blurred as Clara stumbled into her childhood bedroom, now a prison of faded pink walls and peeling wallpaper. She pulled an old duffel bag from the closet and stuffed it with trembling hands. A few dresses, a book or two, her mother's quilt, and the ultrasound photo, creased and rain-stained, but the only proof she wasn't utterly alone. Her mother would have held her, would have whispered comfort, but her mother was gone, leaving her at the mercy of a woman who saw her as nothing more than a stain. "Time's up," Margaret's voice rang like a death knell. Clara stepped back into the living room, clutching the duffel against her chest. Her father stood by the window, his back still turned. She lingered in the doorway, one final plea lodged in her throat. "Daddy," she said softly, praying he would turn, praying he would see her. But he never moved. The storm roared as the front door opened. Rain slashed across her face, cold and merciless. Margaret's voice followed her out like a curse. "Don't ever come back. You're dead to this family." The door slammed shut with finality, and the sound echoed louder than the thunder. For a moment, Clara stood still, drenched within seconds, staring at the house that had never been a home. Her thin jacket clung to her skin, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her heart beating wildly beneath the fragile swell of her stomach. The street lay empty, swallowed by sheets of rain and flickers of lightning. She had no friends to turn to, no relatives who cared, no roof to shield her from the storm. Only the child within her, innocent and undeserving of this cruelty. Clutching her bag tighter, Clara stepped into the night. Her shoes splashed in rising puddles, her body shaking with cold, but she kept moving, one foot after another, guided by nothing but survival. Each step carried her further from the home that rejected her, deeper into a city that would not care if she vanished. The rain blurred her vision, the wind clawed at her clothes, but she pressed on, whispering to the life growing inside her. "You're all I have now," she said, her voice drowned by thunder. "But I'll protect you, somehow." And with those words, Clara disappeared into the storm, carrying nothing but a fragile hope and a love fierce enough to keep her moving through the darkness. Rain lashed the glass towers of the city as Clara stumbled forward, clutching her bag against her chest as if it could shield her from the storm. The streets glistened under the lightning, empty except for the occasional taxi that hissed past without slowing. Her clothes were soaked through, her hair plastered to her pale cheeks. But she kept moving, each step driven by the desperate need to keep her baby safe. She had no plan, no destination, only the instinct to survive. Her father's silence and Margaret's cruelty echoed in her mind, but louder still was the pounding of her own heart and the tiny spark of life within her. At the end of the street, a towering building loomed like a citadel against the storm. Its golden letters shone faintly even through the sheets of rain. Sterling Enterprises. Clara stopped, her chest heaving, the name pressing into her like fate itself. Her hand shook as she reached into her jacket and pulled out the damp ultrasound photo. The date glared up at her, 12 weeks ago, the same night she had met a stranger at the charity gala. A stranger who had made her feel, for the first time in years, like she mattered. She clutched the photo, as though it were her last tether to hope. The wind rose suddenly, snatching the fragile paper from her fingers and tossing it into the air like a leaf. Clara cried out, lunging forward, her knees slamming into the wet pavement as she scrambled after it. The storm howled, blinding her with rain, and she didn't see the figure stepping out of the glass doors until she crashed into him. The collision knocked the air from her lungs, and her bag tumbled to the ground, spilling worn clothes and a tattered photograph of her mother onto the slick pavement. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, scrambling to gather her things. Her voice was hoarse from crying and shouting against the storm. She dared a glance up at the man she had struck, expecting anger or annoyance. Instead, she found herself staring at a tall figure in a dark tailored suit, his hair impossibly perfect despite the rain, his eyes the color of a storm about to break. He seemed carved from the very night itself, untouchable, powerful. But he wasn't looking at her. His gaze was locked on the ultrasound photo lying face up on the ground between them. Clara froze as he bent down and picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. His sharp features shifted from irritation to confusion, to something that looked dangerously close to recognition. He stared at the date, his lips moving as though repeating it under his breath. Then his eyes lifted to hers, piercing and unread. "Abel. This date," he said quietly, the words almost lost beneath the storm. Clara's throat closed, but she forced herself to nod. Her chest ached, as if her heart itself had recognized him. There was something achingly familiar about his face, the intensity of his stare, the way he held that photograph as though it were a lifeline. Lightning split the sky, and for one breathless instant she saw him clearly. Memory slammed into her. The charity gala, the man who had sat beside her, who had listened instead of dismissing her, who had made her feel seen. The man who had taken her in his arms that night with a tenderness she had never known. Her lips parted in shock. "William," she whispered. His jaw tightened at the sound of his name. "Clara," he said slowly, as though testing the weight of it on his tongue. "The gala, 12 weeks ago, you disappeared." His eyes flicked to her stomach, to the tiny curve she was trying desperately to hide. Realization dawned on his face like thunder breaking the sky. She wanted to run, to deny everything, but she couldn't tear her gaze from him. He stepped closer, the storm swirling around them, and draped his expensive coat over her shaking shoulders. It was heavy and warm, smelling faintly of cedar and rain, and she almost broke at the unexpected kindness. "You're freezing," he said firmly, "and we need to talk." Clara clutched the coat tighter, torn between fear and relief. She had been cast out into the storm with nothing but despair, and now the man she thought she would never see again stood before her, holding the proof of their connection in his hand. The storm roared, but for the first time that night, Clara felt the faint stirrings of safety. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Fate had brought her here, to him, and nothing would ever be the same again. The car's headlights cut through the storm as William guided Clara into the sleek black Mercedes way. Waiting at the curb, she hesitated, clutching her bag to her chest, her body trembling from more than just the rain. His coat hung heavy over her shoulders, a shield she didn't feel she deserved. He opened the passenger door with a firmness that left no room for argument, and she slid inside, sinking into the buttery leather that felt too luxurious for someone who had been thrown into the night like trash only an hour earlier. William drove in silence at first, his jaw tight, his hands steady on the wheel. The city lights blurred past them, distorted by the water streaking across the glass. Clara turned her face toward the window, afraid to meet his eyes, afraid of the questions waiting to shatter the fragile stillness between them. But his voice finally came, low and steady, each word carrying the weight of an unspoken truth. "You should have told me," he said. Her fingers gripped the strap of her bag, knuckles white. "I tried," she whispered. "I went to your office. They said you were traveling. They wouldn't let me through. I didn't know how else to reach you. I didn't belong in your world." He glanced at her, storm-gray eyes narrowing as if he could see through every defense she tried to build. "My world," he repeated softly, almost bitterly. "If what I'm holding is true, then that child," his gaze dropped to her stomach, "is part of my world too." The words silenced her more effectively than Margaret's slap ever had. She pressed her palm to her small bump as if to protect it from the weight of his tone. They reached the Sterling estate faster than she expected. The mansion rose out of the storm like something out of a dream, all stone and glass, lit from within by the glow of wealth that spoke of old money and power. Clara's breath caught. It was everything she was not, everything Margaret had spent years telling her she would never deserve. The doors opened before William had even parked. A small, elegant figure stood waiting in the foyer. Beatrice Sterling, silver-haired and graceful, her sharp eyes softening when they landed on Clara. She moved forward without hesitation, taking Clara's cold hands in her warm, steady ones. "Oh, you poor child," she said gently. "You're soaked through. Come in, come in. Let's get you warm." Clara's throat tightened at the unexpected kindness. Before she could answer, other footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Patricia Sterling appeared, tall and impeccably dressed despite the late hour. Her beauty was as cold as the storm outside. Behind her came Emily, her lips curved into a smirk, and Thomas, his eyes gleaming with suspicion. "What is this?" Patricia demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "William, who have you dragged into this house in the middle of the night?" Beatrice straightened, her hand still protectively holding Clara's. "This is Clara. She's our guest, and she will be staying with us." Emily laughed cruelly, the sound echoing against the high ceilings. "A guest? Pregnant and dripping rainwater all over the floor. What are we, a shelter now?" Clara flinched, but William's voice cut through the air like thunder. "Enough!" His gaze swept over his siblings, hard and unyielding. "Clara stays. She's under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." Patricia's eyes narrowed, calculating, her lips curving into a cold smile. "Protection. Interesting choice of words, William. I do hope you know what you're doing." The tension crackled through the room, heavier than the storm outside. Beatrice led Clara gently toward the staircase, murmuring soothing words that felt like balm to wounds she hadn't realized were bleeding so deeply. But as Clara glanced back, she caught the looks Patricia and Emily exchanged with Thomas. Their eyes burned with something darker than disdain. It was a promise, silent but unmistakable. Clara might have found shelter within these walls, but she had also stepped straight into a nest of vipers, and they would not rest until she was gone. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Sterling mansion, warm and golden, but Clara felt no peace as she sat on the edge of the vast bed Beatrice had insisted she take. The silk sheets beneath her fingers felt foreign, as though they belonged to someone else's life. Just hours ago, she had been thrown out into the storm with nothing but a duffel bag and a fading photograph of her mother. Now she was surrounded by luxury so overwhelming it pressed on her chest like a weight. She whispered to the child inside her, promising safety, though she had no idea how to keep that promise in a house where every shadow seemed to hide a watching eye. A soft knock broke the silence. Beatrice entered with a tray balanced carefully in her hands. Her sharp eyes softened at the sight of Clara's pale face and damp lashes. "You didn't eat last night," she said firmly, setting the tray down. "No arguments this morning." Clara tried to protest, but the older woman pressed a warm cup into her hands. You'll need strength, not just for the baby, but for what's coming. The words made Clara's heart stutter. She wanted to ask what Beatrice meant, but before she could, raised voices drifted up from the grand hallway below. Patricia, sharp and commanding. Emily, her tone mocking. Thomas, low and simmering with disdain. Clara froze, listening. She doesn't belong here, Patricia was saying. Already she has William wrapped around her little finger. If we allow this to continue, our family's reputation will be destroyed. Emily's laugh rang out like breaking glass. Reputation isn't the only thing at stake. Look at her. A poor girl with nothing to her name suddenly carrying our future heir. If you don't see the danger, you're blind. Thomas's voice was quieter but colder. The question is not if she should be removed, but how. The words sank into Clara like ice water. She tightened her grip on the cup until her knuckles turned white. Beatrice's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. Do not let their venom into your heart, she said softly. They fear what they cannot control, and you, my dear, are beyond their grasp. That afternoon, William returned from the office, his presence filling the mansion with a quiet intensity. He found Clara in the library, a fire crackling in the hearth. She looked up as he entered, fear flickering in her eyes before relief softened her features. He crossed the room quickly, his gaze never leaving her face. Are they treating you with respect? He asked, his voice low but edged with steel. Clara hesitated, then shook her head. Your grandmother is kind. She's the only one. But the rest, they hate me. Her hand drifted to her stomach as if to shield the child from the cruelty. They want me gone? William's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening like the storm that had brought them together. Let them try. This is my house, my rules, and if anyone dares lay a hand on you or our child, they'll answer to me. The firelight danced across his face, casting shadows that made him look both fierce and untouchable. For the first time, Clara believed he meant it. Yet in the corners of the library, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as if listening. Somewhere deep in the mansion, Patricia and her children were weaving their plans, sharpening their words into weapons and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Clara sipped the warm tea Beatrice had given her, her body trembling with exhaustion but her spirit refusing to break. She had survived Margaret's cruelty, her father's silence, and the storm that nearly swallowed her whole. She would survive this too. What she didn't yet know was that the battle ahead would not just test her strength, but uncover secrets that could shatter the Sterling family forever. The air inside the Sterling mansion grew colder with each passing day, though the fires in every hearth burned bright. Clara felt it in the glances that followed her down the corridors, in the clipped voices that silenced whenever she entered a room, in the way Patricia's smile never reached her eyes. Only Beatrice remained openly kind, her warmth wrapping around Clara like a fragile shield. William's presence gave her strength, but he was often away in meetings, leaving her exposed to the venom that brewed in his family. It began quietly, with whispers carried through the halls. Servants who once smiled now averted their eyes. A vase shattered mysteriously near her bedroom door one morning, the shards arranged too deliberately to be an accident. Clara tried to ignore it, but the tension pressed heavier on her chest with each incident. She carried her small bump protectively, telling herself that she could endure anything as long as her child was safe. One evening, William returned earlier than expected and found her in the kitchen with Beatrice. Clara's hands trembled as she washed dishes, her face pale beneath the glow of the chandelier. He crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her damp hands in his. What happened? He demanded, his tone so sharp that Beatrice looked up from her tea with concern. Clara tried to smile, but the truth slipped out in a rush. They want me gone. Your sister pushed my breakfast tray onto the floor yesterday and called me trash. Your brother followed me down the hall, whispering that I was only here to steal what wasn't mine, and your mother watches every move I make, as if waiting for me to slip. Her voice broke and she shook her head. I don't belong here, William. His eyes darkened with a fury she had never seen before. He drew her close, his jaw tight with determination. You belong with me, he said, every word like a vow. This house, this family, this life, they are mine to control, and you are mine to protect. If they can't see that, then they'll learn. But Patricia was already weaving her first real strike. The very next morning, as the household gathered for breakfast, she rose with perfect poise, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced even Emily's sneers. "We should discuss the matter of inheritance," she said, her gaze sliding to Clara. "It would be foolish not to acknowledge how this girl's presence complicates the Sterling legacy." Clara froze, her spoon halfway to her lips. Beatrice bristled, setting down her cup with a sharp click. But Patricia continued smoothly, her words dripping with calculated venom. "If the child she carries truly belongs to William, then perhaps it deserves consideration. But without proof, how do we know it isn't simply her attempt to tie herself to this family permanently?" Emily smirked. Thomas leaned back with smug satisfaction, and Clara felt her world tilt beneath her feet. Every eye in the room turned to her, judgment heavy and merciless. Her face burned as she pressed her hand protectively over her belly. William's chair scraped against the marble as he stood abruptly, his presence towering, his voice low and dangerous. "Enough. Not another word against her or our child. If proof is what you want, then proof you'll have. But understand this. Clara is not leaving. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." The silence that followed was thick with fury and unspoken threats. Patricia's smile remained, but her eyes glinted like steel. Beatrice reached for Clara's hand under the table, squeezing it gently, her silent promise of solidarity stronger than words. Clara sat frozen between, in fear and gratitude, her heart pounding, knowing that this was only the beginning. For the first time since stepping into the Sterling mansion, she realized she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for her child's future, for her love with William, and for a place in a family that would rather see her destroyed. The battle lines had been drawn, and there would be no turning back. The mansion stood quiet that night, but Clara could feel danger moving in its silence like a predator waiting in the dark. Her steps echoed faintly across the marble floors as she carried a tray of tea toward Beatrice's sitting room. It was a simple act, but Clara's heart raced as if she were trespassing in a place she had no right to be. The whispers of Patricia and her children earlier at dinner still clung to her ears. They had spoken as though she were invisible, yet every word had been sharpened for her to hear. Words about how fragile Beatrice was, how easily trust could be broken, how one mistake could expose Clara as nothing more than a parasite. She entered the sitting room to find Beatrice by the fire, her silver hair shining in the glow, her eyes soft and welcoming. Clara set the tray down with trembling hands. Beatrice noticed at once. "What's troubling you, child?" she asked, gently. Clara sank into the chair opposite her, wrapping her arms around her stomach. "They're trying to break me," she admitted in a low voice. "Every day it gets worse, and now they're saying the baby might not even be William's." Beatrice's gaze sharpened. "And what do you say?" Clara met her eyes, the firelight catching the tears gathering there. "I say this child is his. I say I love him. But love doesn't seem enough in a house built on suspicion." Beatrice reached across and took her hand. "Love is the only thing that will be enough in the end. Don't let them rob you of it." The moment felt like a fragile sanctuary, but it shattered within hours. Just before dawn, a scream tore through the halls, high and desperate. Clara stumbled from her room, clutching her belly as she followed the sound. Servants rushed ahead, doors flew open, and soon the entire household converged near Beatrice's quarters. She was collapsed on the floor beside her bed, pale and unmoving, her breathing shallow. Panic erupted around them. Patricia pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide with feigned horror. Emily clutched her robe and whispered theatrically, "Oh no, what happened?" Thomas stood silent, watching Clara with an expression too smooth, too controlled. Clara fell to her knees beside Beatrice, her hands shaking as she tried to rouse her. Please wake up," she begged, her tears spilling freely. William burst into the room moments later, his face ashen. He dropped beside them, his hand gripping his grandmother's. "Call an ambulance," he barked. "Now." As the medics worked and Beatrice was carried out, Clara caught the weight of Patricia's gaze, cold, sharp, and calculating. The older woman's lips curved into the faintest smile before she turned to comfort her children. A smile Clara knew wasn't meant for anyone else to see. Hours later, at the hospital, the doctor's words froze the blood in Clara's veins. "It was poison," he said grimly. "Oleander, most likely. Deliberate." The silence that followed was thick with suspicion. Then Thomas's voice cut through, calm but laced with venom. Who had reason to want her gone? Who had something to gain? His eyes slid to Clara, slow and deliberate. Emily followed with a hiss of mock concern. "She was the last one seen with grandmother last night. She brought her tea." Clara's breath caught, her heart hammering. "No, I didn't. I would never." But the words tangled in her throat. William stared at her, torn between loyalty and doubt, his face unreadable in the harsh hospital light. Patricia stepped closer, her voice silk over steel. "Until this is resolved," said Clara, "perhaps it's better if you stay away from the family. For everyone's safety." Clara felt the floor vanish beneath her. The storm that had thrown her into William's world had been cruel, but this was worse. She was no longer just an outcast. She was being painted as a danger, as the enemy within. And as she sat trembling in that sterile waiting room, surrounded by cold eyes and whispered accusations, Clara understood the truth. Someone in this family wanted her destroyed. Someone had poisoned Beatrice not to kill the old woman, but to frame her. The game had changed, and now it wasn't only her future at stake. It was her freedom, her child's safety, and the fragile love she had begun to trust. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and fear as Clara sat alone on the hard plastic chair, her hands pressed protectively against the curve of her stomach. Hours had passed since Beatrice had been taken into intensive care, hours filled with glares from Patricia, mocking whispers from Emily, and cold, calculating looks from Thomas. Each moment seemed designed to break her, to push her further into a corner she could not escape. When William finally appeared, his face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were unreadable. Clara rose instantly, desperate for reassurance. Is Beatrice going to be all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. He hesitated, then answered, "The doctors say she's stable for now. But the poison, it was strong. They don't know if she'll wake up." The words struck like a knife. Clara gripped his arm. "You believe me, don't you? You know I would never hurt her." Her eyes searched his desperately. William didn't answer right away. He looked at her, torn, his jaw tight with conflict. "They found vials in your room," he finally whispered. "Small bottles hidden in the dresser. They said it was oleander extract, the same poison used on my grandmother." Clara's heart stopped. "That's impossible. I've never seen them before. Someone planted them." Her voice rose with panic, but behind her, Patricia's voice rang out smoothly, cutting through like a blade. "Convenient excuses. A poor girl with everything to gain and nothing to lose. Who else could it have been?" Detectives arrived soon after, their questions sharp, their gazes heavy with suspicion. Clara tried to explain, tried to tell them how she had only ever cared for Beatrice, how she had been framed, but every word seemed twisted back against her. The officers listened politely, but doubt was written all over their faces. As the questioning stretched into the night, Clara's body began to tremble with exhaustion. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her terror. She pressed her hand to her belly, whispering silently that she would protect them, no matter what. But when the cold metal of handcuffs closed around her wrists, despair sank deep into her bones. "You're under arrest for attempted murder," the detective said flatly, and the hospital walls blurred as Clara was led away. William stood frozen, watching, his face shadowed with conflict. Clara turned toward him, tears streaking her cheeks. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "You have to believe me. I didn't do this." But his silence was heavier than any accusation. Back at the mansion, Patricia and her children gathered in the sitting room, their expressions dark but satisfied. Emily poured herself a glass of wine, her smirk curling as she lifted it in mock celebration. Well, that was easier than expected. She won't trouble us anymore. But Patricia's eyes were sharper, colder. Do not celebrate yet. William's feelings for her run deeper than he admits. If Beatrice recovers, she may undo everything. We'll need to make sure the girl stays buried in suspicion, with no way back. Meanwhile, in the dim holding cell of the police station, Clara sat curled on the thin cot, the weight of the engagement ring on her finger pressing like a cruel reminder of what she stood to lose. Fear clawed at her, but beneath it burned a spark of defiance. She whispered to her unborn child, her voice raw. They think they can destroy us, but I'll find a way. I'll survive this storm, just like I survived the last. What she didn't know was that the true enemy hadn't yet revealed their hand. The poisoning of Beatrice was only the beginning, and the most shocking betrayal was still waiting in the shadows. The harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room cast Clara's face in shadows, making her look older, worn, and fragile. The detectives sat across from her, their voices calm but cutting, each question meant to tighten the noose around her neck. "You found Beatrice first, didn't you?" one asked, pen scratching against his notepad. "You were the one who prepared her tea the night before. You admit you were the last to see her alive before she collapsed. Why should we believe you didn't slip something into her drink?" Clara's hands shook as she held them in her lap, her nails biting into her skin. "Because I loved her," she whispered fiercely. "She was the only one in that house who treated me like I mattered. She was my only friend. Why would I harm the only person who cared about me?" The detectives exchanged looks. The second leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Then explain the vials found in your dresser. Oleander extract doesn't just appear by accident. Who put them there if not you?" Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Patricia, or Emily, or Thomas, any of them could have planted it. They've hated me since the day I walked into that mansion. They would do anything to see me gone." Her words hung in the air, desperate but unconvincing. On the other side of the glass, William stood with his arms crossed, watching every flicker of her expression. His heart tore in two as suspicion warred with the memory of her kindness. Patricia appeared at his side, her voice smooth and dripping with poison. "Look at her, William. She's clever. She plays the innocent victim, but it's always the ones who look weak who strike hardest when no one expects it. Your grandmother trusted her, and now she's lying in a hospital bed. Do you really think that's a coincidence?" William's jaw tightened, his silence giving her words weight. Clara glanced up through the glass, her eyes locking on his, pleading for belief, but he turned away before she could read his heart. By dawn, the charges were formal. Attempted murder, conspiracy. Clara was led to a holding cell, the cold clang of the bars sealing her fate. She curled on the thin mattress, clutching her belly as tears finally broke free. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as though fighting with her. "I won't give up," she whispered to the life growing inside her. "They think they can bury me, but they don't know who they're dealing with." Back at the mansion, Patricia's mask of icy composure slipped for a brief moment as she closed her study door. In the glow of a desk lamp, she unlocked a small wooden box hidden in the back of a drawer. Inside were more vials of oleander, identical to those planted in Clara's room. She lifted one carefully, the faintest smile curving her lips. Emily entered quietly, her eyes gleaming with cruel delight. "So it worked. She's finished." Patricia gave a curt nod. "For now, but we must stay vigilant. Beatrice is strong. If she wakes, everything unravels. Until then, we make sure William doubts her completely. Love is fragile. Doubt will break him faster than any poison." What they didn't know was that Beatrice's pulse had steadied through the night. Her body was frail, but her spirit was steel, and as her eyes flickered open in the hospital bed, she whispered one word that would change everything. "Clara." The storm had not broken Clara yet. It was only beginning to reveal its true fury. The holding cell was a cage of concrete and shadows, and Clara felt every second stretch like an eternity. Her body was weary, her eyes hollow, but it was the silence that pressed hardest on her chest. She sat on the thin cot, one hand on her belly, whispering promises to the child she carried. Promises of survival, of love, of a future beyond steel bars. Yet deep inside, fear gnawed at her. Every minute she stayed locked away, the family's lies grew stronger, painting her as a villain she had never been. The clanging of boots broke the silence. A guard appeared, his expression unreadable. "You have a visitor?" he said gruffly. Clara's heart leapt. For a fleeting moment she imagined William standing there, ready to take her hand, to fight for her. But when she was escorted into the sterile visitation room, it wasn't William she saw. Patricia sat on the other side of the glass, immaculate as always, her lips curved in a smile too sharp to be kind. "Clara," Patricia purred, her voice smooth through the phone receiver. "Such a pity it's come to this. You had such potential. But you never understood the rules of this world." Clara's grip tightened on the receiver. "You did this. You poisoned Beatrice. You framed me." Patricia's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Careful with your accusations. They'll sound like the desperate lies of a girl with everything to lose. No one will believe you over me. I built this family's reputation. I know how to protect it." Clara's voice broke with anger and desperation. "Why destroy me when all I ever wanted was to love Willia?" Patricia leaned closer, her smile cold. "Because love means nothing in this house. Power does. Money does. And Beatrice was about to hand both to you and your unborn child. I couldn't allow that. You don't belong in our world, Clara. You never will." The line went dead as Patricia placed the receiver down and walked away, leaving Clara trembling with fury. For the first time, she understood fully. Patricia hadn't just framed her, she had done it to erase her completely. The stress became unbearable. Hours later, pain ripped through Clara's body, sharp and unrelenting. She gasped, clutching her stomach as a contraction seized her. Panic spread among the guards, one calling for medical assistance as Clara collapsed to the cold floor. She was only 28 weeks. Too soon. Much too soon. The sirens of an ambulance wailed as she was rushed to the hospital, her vision blurring with every wave of pain. She cried out for William, for Beatrice, for anyone who might still believe her. But the faces around her were strangers, their voices clinical, detached. In another wing of the same hospital, Beatrice stirred at last. Her eyes opened weakly, but her mind was clear. She remembered the bitter taste of the tea, the cold smile on Patricia's face. She remembered Clara's terrified voice calling for help. And she knew, with every beat of her fragile heart, who had tried to kill her. As Clara was wheeled into the delivery room, fighting through the agony of premature labor, Beatrice demanded to see the detectives. Her voice was frail but firm. "You've arrested the wrong person. Clara is innocent, and I know who poisoned me." At that exact moment, William rushed through the hospital doors, his chest heaving, torn between fear for the woman he loved and shame for doubting her. The choice he made in the next hours would decide not only Clara's fate, but the future of the family itself. And as the storm outside battered against the hospital windows, Clara's cries echoed through the halls, mingling with the newborn wail of a child fighting to live. The darkest hour had come. But it was also the moment where truth began clawing its way into the light. The storm outside roared against the hospital walls, as if it sensed the chaos unfolding within. Clara's cries filled the delivery room, raw with pain and fear, her hands clutching the rails of the bed as another contraction tore through her. The doctor's voice was urgent but steady, calling for the neonatal team, preparing for a child that was coming far too early. Clara's world spun between agony and despair, but through the haze she whispered to her unborn son, begging him to be strong, to survive. Just down the hall, Beatrice Sterling sat upright in her hospital bed, her frail frame cloaked in determination. Her voice, though weak, carried authority as she spoke to the detectives who stood at her side. "You've made a terrible mistake. Clara is innocent. I remember everything now. It was Patricia who prepared my tea. I saw her hands tremble when she served it, and the bitterness of oleander was unmistakable. She wanted me gone before I could finalize my will. She framed Clara to make her an easy scapegoat." Detective Harris's eyes widened. "You're certain of this?" "As certain as I am breathing," Beatrice said firmly. "Check Patricia's greenhouse. She grows oleander there, more than any sane person should. You'll find proof." The detectives moved swiftly, orders crackling over their radios. Patricia Sterling was taken into custody moments later, her composure cracking as she shouted denials, her children watching in stunned silence. Emily tried to follow, protesting, but Thomas held her back, his own face pale with the realization that their mother's schemes had gone too far. Meanwhile, William burst into the delivery room, his heart hammering. He rushed to Clara's side, his hand wrapping around hers. She was drenched in sweat, her eyes filled with pain and betrayal. "You came, he whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought you stopped believing me." William's throat closed with shame. He pressed his forehead to hers, gripping her hand tighter. "I was a fool. I should have trusted you. I'll never doubt you again. Please, Clara, just hold on. I'm here. I love you." Her cries rose again as the baby came into the world, tiny and fragile. His first breath a weak but defiant wail that cut through the storm like a miracle. The doctors worked quickly, placing him in a specialized incubator, wires and tubes surrounding his delicate body. Clara wept with both relief and fear as she watched their son's tiny chest rise and fall. William kissed her trembling hands, his own eyes wet with tears. "He's perfect. He's ours. And I swear I'll protect both of you with everything I have." News traveled fast. By morning, Patricia's arrest was splashed across headlines, her reputation shattered. Emily and Thomas, stripped of their illusions of control, packed their things and left the mansion, unable to face the disgrace. The empire they thought was theirs to command was slipping through their fingers. Beatrice, frail but resolute, arrived at Clara's hospital room later that day. She held Clara's hand with surprising strength. "You saved my life," she said softly, "and they nearly destroyed yours. But no more. From this day forward, you are my granddaughter in every way that matters. You, William, and this precious child are the future of this family." Clara's tears fell freely, not from despair, but from relief. For the first time in years, she felt safe. She wasn't alone anymore. Weeks later, the Sterling mansion stood quieter, but brighter. Clara walked its halls with her newborn son in her arms, William at her side. The storm that had begun with her being cast out into the rain had led her here, to a home filled with love, rather than cruelty. On the terrace at sunset, William slipped his arms around her waist, his chin resting gently on her shoulder as he looked down at their son. "Do you remember the night we met?" he murmured. "I thought it was chance, but now I know it was fate. You were meant to be mine, Clara, and this boy was meant to be ours." Clara leaned against him, her heart finally at peace. "They tried to break me," she whispered. "But love saved me. You saved me." William turned her to face him, his eyes fierce with devotion. "No, you saved yourself. You walked through the storm and survived. And now, we build a future together. No lies, no fear, only love." As the last light of day painted the sky in gold and rose, Clara realized the storm had not destroyed her. It had carried her into the arms of the man who would never let her go. Their story had begun in darkness, but it ended here, with hope, redemption, and a love strong enough to outlast any tempest. The storm was over, and the future was theirs.